Are some scars meant to be worn on the skin, while others echo in the quiet emptiness of a life left behind? For an aging veteran and a forgotten German shepherd, salvation did not arrive on a glorious battlefield, but in the final, desperate hours before a scheduled euthanasia. Please subscribe to the channel and let us begin this journey together. It was the autumn of 2023, and the streets of Silverton, Oregon, were alive with the steady, comforting rhythm of suburban life. Neighbors stood by pristine wooden fences chatting about the upcoming holidays. Children chased each other down the wide sidewalks, and delivery vehicles navigated the winding, tree-lined roads. Raymond lived right in the center of this bustling community, yet he existed on an entirely different frequency. He was a retired veteran, a man whose youth and vitality had been spent in uniform, navigating harsh environments where every single second carried the weight of survival. Now, surrounded by the comfortable safety of peacetime, he felt adrift. The world had moved forward with unyielding speed, leaving him anchored to a past he could not forget and a present where he did not quite belong. He was respected by his neighbors, greeted with polite nods and waves, but he remained utterly isolated, a quiet observer of a world that no longer required his service. One brisk evening, the glowing screen of his tablet provided his only company in the silent house. Raymond was scrolling aimlessly through local community notice boards when a particular image forced his thumb to stop. It was an urgent plea from Second Chance Rescue, the local animal shelter. The photograph attached to the post showed the sterile, cold interior of a wire mesh kennel. Inside, a large, aging German shepherd with a severely silver-frosted muzzle lay resting on the concrete floor. Wrapped tightly within the old dog's heavy front legs was a tiny, trembling puppy. The puppy had buried its face deep into the older dog's thick chest fur, seeking a desperately needed refuge from the overwhelming environment. The older German shepherd was looking straight into the camera lens. His dark eyes carried a profound, weary resignation, yet his posture was fiercely protective. He was offering a shield he could not even provide for himself. The text beneath the photograph explained the heartbreaking reality. The older dog, temporarily named Rex, was scheduled to be euthanized at dawn. His designated holding period had simply run out. The puppy, Toby, had been placed with him temporarily due to severe overcrowding at the facility. Raymond stared at the screen, his chest tightening. He recognized the look in Rex's eyes perfectly. It was the distinct gaze of a soldier who knew the absolute end was approaching, but chose to hold the line anyway, protecting the vulnerable until his last breath. A heavy wave of empathy washed over Raymond. He knew exactly what it felt like to be discarded, to be deemed obsolete by a system that no longer had a use for you. Raymond shut off the tablet and stood up, grabbing his coat and his keys. He would be waiting at the shelter doors before the staff even arrived to unlock them. The morning air was biting and cold when Raymond pulled his truck into the parking lot of Second Chance Rescue. Inside, the atmosphere was chaotic, filled with the continuous, echoing barks of abandoned animals seeking attention. Raymond stood firmly at the front desk, his voice steady and resolute, requesting the immediate adoption of both the senior German shepherd and the young puppy. The shelter volunteer, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes, looked incredibly surprised, but immensely relieved. As she quickly processed the adoption paperwork, she explained Rex's tragic circumstances to Raymond. Rex had not always been a street dog. When animal control brought him in, they located a microchip embedded in his shoulder, but it was a heavily outdated, older generation model. The data inside the chip was completely corrupted, yielding only a string of unreadable digital characters. Because the records could not be traced, the registry could not be accessed, and no owner ever came forward to claim him. Rex became just another nameless senior dog taking up valuable space on the adoption floor. He was a victim of failing technology and forgotten responsibility. When the volunteer opened the metal kennel gate, Toby immediately hid behind Rex's massive frame. Rex stepped forward slowly, his arthritic joints visibly stiff, but his head was held high with undeniable dignity. He walked directly to Raymond and leaned his heavy shoulder against the veteran's leg, offering a silent, physical gesture of gratitude. Raymond gently rested his hand on the dog's broad head, and they walked out to the truck together. The drive back to the house in Silverton was quiet. The lively neighborhood outside the truck's windows suddenly felt significantly less isolating for Raymond, with the two dogs resting in the back seat. That first night in their new home, the house was draped in a peaceful silence. Toby, absolutely exhausted from the intense stress of the shelter environment, finally collapsed into a deep sleep on a thick woolen rug in the center of the living room. Rex, however, did not sleep. The old German shepherd positioned himself near the edge of the rug, keeping a watchful, unwavering vigil over the breathing puppy. Raymond sat in his worn leather armchair across the room, watching the dog intently. For a very long time, neither man nor dog moved. Then, Rex slowly turned his large head and met Raymond's gaze across the dim room. In the soft shadows of the living room, a profound, silent conversation passed between them. Raymond saw the gray spreading across Rex's muzzle. The heavy weariness settled deep in his bones, and the quiet, unbreakable dignity that refused to surrender. They were two old soldiers, discarded by a society that prized the new and the youthful, finding themselves sharing the same quiet sanctuary. The mutual understanding required no words. They were safe now. The defining moment of their new bond arrived late the following afternoon. Raymond was sitting on the back patio, observing the dogs in the fenced backyard. A heavy sanitation truck rolled past the house, its massive engine roaring and its air brakes releasing with a sharp, hissing mechanical shriek. Toby panicked instantly. The puppy scrambled backward in the grass, crying out in genuine fear. Without a fraction of a second's hesitation, Rex moved. Despite the visible stiffness in his hips, the old dog positioned his large body directly between the frightened puppy and the wooden fence, creating a solid barrier against the source of the terrifying noise. Rex did not bark. He simply stood his ground, calm, squared, and immovable, until the heavy truck drove away down the street. Raymond narrowed his eyes, setting his coffee mug down on the table. There was a specific, highly practiced discipline in the way Rex had moved to intercept the threat. It was not the reactive, frantic instinct of a regular house pet. It was deliberate, ingrained training. Raymond slowly walked out onto the patio grass. He stood up straight, squaring his shoulders, letting his relaxed civilian posture shift back into a commanding, authoritative stance. He made a sharp, clicking sound with his tongue to catch Rex's attention. Without uttering a single word, Raymond raised his right hand and delivered a crisp, silent military hand signal for a sit command. Rex immediately stopped panting. The dog's ears swiveled sharply forward. Without questioning the silent order, Rex lowered his hindquarters and sat perfectly still on the grass, his dark eyes locked intensely onto Raymond's face, awaiting the next instruction. Raymond felt a sudden, thick tightness form in his throat. He shifted his arm, giving the precise, silent signal to stay. Rex froze in place like a statue, his attention absolute and unwavering, even as Toby playfully nudged his front leg. Raymond slowly lowered his hand, his heart beating heavily against his ribs. The truth settled firmly in the cool autumn air. Rex was a military working dog. He had served, he had followed dangerous orders, and somehow, due to a corrupted piece of technology and the cruel passage of time, his service had been entirely erased. He had been left behind. Raymond walked over and knelt in the grass next to the large German shepherd, wrapping his arms around the dog's thick, warm neck. "You are not forgotten anymore," Raymond whispered into the silver fur. "Neither of us are." The weeks following the adoption brought a profound shift to the quiet house in Silverton. As the crisp autumn of 2023 surrendered to the encroaching chill of early winter, Raymond found the heavy, invisible armor he had worn for years beginning to crack. The trio was settling into a comfortable, unspoken rhythm, forged by mutual need and silent understanding. For Raymond, the psychological trauma of his military service had always been a solitary burden, manifesting in restless nights and a hypervigilant edge that kept the civilian world at a distance. But Rex changed the atmosphere of the home completely. The old German shepherd possessed a remarkable, disciplined calmness that anchored Raymond's frayed nerves. When Raymond woke in the dead of night, his heart hammering against his ribs from the lingering echoes of a battlefield nightmare, he would find Rex already sitting beside the bed. The dog never panicked. He simply maintained a stoic, vigilant posture, offering his broad, warm head for Raymond to rest his trembling hand upon. Rex's presence was a continuous reminder that the war was over, that they had both survived, and that the perimeter was secure. While Rex provided a grounding force, Toby injected a chaotic, brilliant energy into Raymond's life. The puppy was a relentless engine of curiosity, entirely unaware of the heavy pasts carried by his two older companions. Toby's daily walks through the neighborhood became a sudden bridge to the outside world. The puppy would eagerly tangle his leash around fire hydrants, enthusiastically steal garden gloves from neighboring yards, and demand affection from anyone passing by on the sidewalk. Because of Toby's antics, Raymond found himself stopping to untangle the leash, and consequently, engaging in actual conversations. He exchanged pleasantries with the mail carrier, apologized to the elderly woman next door for a stolen morning newspaper, and slowly began to learn the names of the people he had lived near for years. The veteran, who had once treated his neighbors as passing scenery, was finally stepping back into the light of the community, pulled along by the joyful persistence of a puppy and the steady loyalty of an old soldier. However, the peaceful routine they had built was abruptly threatened in late December. Meteorological warnings began broadcasting across every local channel, predicting a winter storm of historic proportions moving rapidly across the Pacific Northwest. The sky over Silverton turned a bruised, heavy violet before unleashing a relentless, blinding onslaught of snow and ice. The fierce blizzard swallowed the town within hours. The wind howled through the streets, tearing dead branches from the ancient oak trees and piling snowdrifts high against the doors of the residential homes. By nightfall, the strain on the town's infrastructure proved too much. A transformer blew several streets away with a brilliant flash of blue light, and immediately, Raymond's entire neighborhood was plunged into total darkness. For the first few hours, Raymond relied on the residual heat of the house, wrapping himself in thick wool blankets and keeping the dogs close. But as the severe storm raged on outside, the temperature inside the home plummeted at an alarming rate. Raymond's breath began to form visible white plumes in the living room air. He watched Rex struggle to stand, the biting cold seeping deep into the old dog's arthritic joints, causing a severe stiffness that made the veteran's heart ache. The heating system was completely dead, and the digital thermometer on the wall offered a grim reading that confirmed they could not stay. If they remained in the freezing house overnight, Rex might not have the physical strength to walk by morning. Raymond packed a heavy canvas duffel bag with dog food, bottled water, a first aid kit, and thermal blankets. He layered his clothing, putting on his old, heavy military parka. Knowing the deep snow would be agonizing for the senior dog, Raymond carefully lifted Rex and carried him to the front door, while Toby followed closely, sensing the urgency in the air. Stepping out into the storm was like walking into a frozen, turbulent ocean. The wind battered them instantly, stealing the breath from Raymond's lungs. He carried Rex through the knee-deep snow, fighting against the powerful gusts, while Toby struggled bravely in the tracks Raymond left behind. They pushed forward toward the Riverside Community Center, located just a few blocks away, which city officials had designated as an emergency evacuation shelter because of its massive industrial backup generator. When they finally pushed through the heavy double doors of the community center, the contrast was staggering. The grand hall was bathed in the warm, yellow glow of emergency lighting. The steady, powerful hum of the backup generator vibrating through the floorboards felt like a lifeline. The massive interior was crowded with evacuated residents sitting on folding cots, wrapping their shivering children in blankets, and drinking hot coffee distributed by exhausted volunteers. Raymond found a quiet corner near the entrance of the center's side hall, a large annex typically used for community storage and overflow seating during local events. He set out the thermal blankets, creating a soft, warm bed for the dogs. Rex immediately curled into a tight circle, exhausted by the cold, while Toby tucked himself securely into the curve of the older dog's stomach. Raymond sat on the floor beside them, leaning his weary back against the cinder-block wall, finally allowing his muscles to relax as the ambient heat of the building began to thaw his frozen hands. Outside, the blizzard showed absolutely no signs of relenting. The snow continued to fall at an unprecedented rate, layering heavily upon the flat, expansive roof of the community center. It happened shortly after midnight, when the exhaustion of the crowd had finally quieted the main hall into a restless slumber. First, there was a deep, agonizing groan from the ceiling, a sound like a massive ship's hull straining against crushing water pressure. Raymond's eyes snapped open. His military training instantly flooded his system with adrenaline. Beside him, Rex's head shot up, the dog's ears pinning back flat against his skull. The structural groan was followed by the sharp, terrifying screech of tearing metal. The massive steel beams supporting the flat roof of the side hall and the storage area were buckling under the immense, uncalculated tonnage of the accumulated ice and snow. Raymond barely had time to throw his body over Rex and Toby before the architecture gave way completely. The sound of the collapse was deafening, a violent roar of shattering concrete, snapping steel, and tearing drywall. A massive section of the side hall's ceiling plummeted downward, bringing with it heavy ventilation ducts, lighting fixtures, and the freezing wrath of the storm above. The impact shook the foundation of the entire building, throwing a thick, choking cloud of pulverized drywall and concrete dust into the air. The emergency lights flickered wildly and then died, severing the connection to the generator line in that wing. Absolute, impenetrable darkness swallowed the hall. When the violent shuddering of the floor finally ceased, a horrifying silence stretched through the black dust, lasting only a few seconds before the screams began. People were coughing, crying out into the void, desperately calling for their loved ones. Raymond pushed himself up off the floor, his lungs burning from the thick dust. He reached down frantically, his hands finding the warm, solid shoulders of Rex and the trembling, smaller form of Toby. They had narrowly escaped the direct impact zone, positioned just inches outside the primary collapse. But as Raymond looked toward the side hall, his eyes adjusting to the pitch-black environment, a cold dread settled into his stomach. The entire annex was gone, replaced by a mountainous ruin of twisted metal, shattered concrete, and heavy wooden beams. Underneath that massive frozen tomb of debris, residents and volunteers were trapped, buried alive in the freezing dark. Raymond gripped Rex's collar in the darkness. The old soldier and the veteran were no longer just seeking shelter. The battlefield had found them once again. The immediate aftermath of the collapse left the main hall in a state of suffocating panic. A thick, choking cloud of pulverized concrete and shredded insulation rolled through the emergency lighting, coating the terrified evacuees in a pale gray film. The freezing winter air poured into the building through the ruined ceiling, instantly dropping the ambient temperature and carrying the bitter, unforgiving bite of the blizzard directly into the shelter. People were rushing forward in the dim light, their voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus of desperation as they tried to reach the mountain of debris that now blocked the side hall. Raymond quickly assessed the frantic situation. First responders from the local volunteer fire department, who had been stationed at the center to help manage the evacuation, were already sprinting toward the wreckage. They were operating on pure adrenaline, grabbing at fractured wooden beams and shattered drywall with their bare hands, desperate to reach the muffled cries echoing from beneath the collapsed structure. Raymond knew instantly that their frantic efforts were dangerous. Decades of military experience, of reading the aftermath of destruction and understanding the fragile physics of a collapsed zone, screamed at him to intervene. He grabbed Toby's leash and turned to the elderly neighbor he had befriended over the past few weeks, a woman who was sitting on a nearby cot, trembling but unhurt. Raymond pressed the leather loop of the leash firmly into her hands. He looked her directly in the eyes, his voice carrying an unwavering authority that cut through the surrounding hysteria. He asked her to keep the young dog secure and far away from the unstable perimeter. Toby whimpered, his small body vibrating with anxiety as he watched Raymond step away. But the veteran knew the puppy had to remain in the safe zone. Striding toward the mountain of debris, Raymond raised his voice, commanding the young rescue volunteers to stop pulling at the wreckage. He pointed toward a massive, severely bowed steel support pillar that was resting precariously on a pile of shattered cinder blocks. He explained with absolute certainty that the entire mountain of rubble was currently locked in a fragile balance. If they continued to pull debris blindly from the outer edges, they would cause a secondary collapse, instantly crushing whoever was trapped in the voids beneath. They needed a surgical approach. They needed to know exactly where the survivors were buried before they moved a single piece of steel or stone. The rescue volunteers looked at him, their faces pale with helpless frustration. The town's search and rescue equipment was trapped on the other side of Silverton, completely immobilized by the historic snowdrifts. They had no thermal cameras and no acoustic listening devices. Raymond turned his attention back to the edge of the rubble, where Rex was standing at strict attention. The old German shepherd's ears were pinned forward, his nose already twitching as he processed the complex layers of scent drifting from the wreckage. He was ready, but Raymond could see the severe physical toll the freezing air was already taking on the senior dog. Rex's hind legs were trembling, the biting cold rapidly stiffening his arthritic joints. The temperature in the collapsed wing was dropping below freezing, and the terrain of jagged concrete and twisted metal would be agonizing to navigate. Without a moment of hesitation, Raymond unzipped his heavy military parka. He stripped off the thick, insulated jacket, exposing himself to the freezing wind howling through the broken roof. He knelt beside the old soldier and carefully draped the heavy parka over Rex's back, wrapping the thick material securely around the dog's hips and hindquarters. He used the jacket's canvas straps to fasten it snugly under the dog's stomach, creating a dense thermal barrier against the bitter cold. He looked into Rex's dark, intelligent eyes, resting his bare hand against the side of the dog's face. He gave a quiet, firm verbal command, releasing the dog to begin the search. Rex moved forward, ascending the treacherous mountain of debris. The old German shepherd navigated the shifting terrain with a slow, deliberate grace, his body low to the ground. The darkness within the collapsed voids was absolute, but Rex did not rely on his vision. He relied on a lifetime of disciplined training and an instinct that age could not diminish. The environment was brutal. The jagged edges of broken tiles and torn steel gratings sliced at the freezing air. As Rex pressed deeper into the narrow, suffocating crevices of the rubble, the intense physical exertion began to drain his remaining strength. His heavy, labored breath materialized as thick white clouds in the freezing air, rising like smoke against the ruined ceiling. Because his body could not cool itself through the heavy layers of fur and the wrapped military jacket, the old dog's internal temperature spiked from the immense effort of balancing on the unstable ruins. The fleshy pads of his paws became raw, turning a bright, inflamed red as they soaked with sweat, leaving faint, damp prints across the freezing, dust-covered concrete. The agony in Rex's hips and knees flared into a blinding, consuming pain. His hind legs, wrapped securely in the parka, began to drag slightly as the cartilage ground together. He slipped on a slanted slab of concrete, his chest hitting the stone hard. The old dog lay there in the freezing darkness, his muscles trembling violently. The physical wall had been reached. His aging body was finally giving out. He closed his eyes, his breathing ragged and shallow in the suffocating dust. Then, cutting through the ambient noise of the wind and the distant shouts of the rescue workers, a sharp, piercing vocalization echoed across the grand hall. It was Toby. The puppy, watching from the safety of the neighbor's arms, let out a desperate, frantic call into the ruins. It was not just a sound. To Rex, it was the undeniable call of his pack. It was a stark, ringing reminder of the fragile life he had sworn to protect on his very first night in a cold shelter. A reminder of the family that was waiting for him in the light. Rex's eyes snapped open. The exhaustion in his bones was momentarily eclipsed by a fierce, undeniable surge of adrenaline. He pushed his heavy frame up from the concrete, his red, sweating paws finding a desperate purchase on the stone. He ignored the burning pain in his joints and crawled forward, squeezing his broad chest through a narrow gap in the twisted metal framing. A few feet deeper into the dark void, the scent of fear and human breath became overwhelmingly strong. Rex stopped above a dense layer of intact drywall that had formed a protective tent over a hollow cavity. He lowered his nose to a small crack in the material and let out a deep, resonant, booming call that shook the dust from the surrounding beams. He planted his front paws firmly on the slab, refusing to move, signaling with absolute certainty that he had found them. Guided by the dog's relentless signaling, Raymond and the rescue team moved in along the safe path Rex had carved out. Moving with extreme caution, they braced the surrounding debris and cut through the drywall. Beneath the protective pocket, 4 people were huddled together, terrified and freezing, but entirely uninjured. As the survivors were carefully lifted from the wreckage and passed down the line to the waiting medical volunteers, a massive wave of relief washed over the exhausted crowd. Cheers and tears of gratitude filled the emergency shelter. Raymond climbed carefully down the debris pile, carrying the heavy, exhausted body of the old German shepherd in his arms. Rex's head rested heavily on the veteran's shoulder, his breathing slow and ragged. The moment Raymond's boots touched the solid floor of the main hall, Toby broke away from the neighbor and sprinted across the room. The puppy threw himself at Raymond's legs, whining with frantic joy, pressing his small nose desperately against Rex's dangling paws. Rex opened his eyes, letting out a long, weary sigh of absolute contentment, and gently rested his chin against the puppy's head. Raymond held them both close, burying his face in the dog's fur, his own tears mixing with the concrete dust on his cheeks. They had held the line. They had all come home. In the months that followed the historic blizzard of 2023, the town of Silverton slowly rebuilt. But the memory of that night became permanently woven into the community's foundation. The story of the forgotten military dog and the quiet veteran who risked everything to save their neighbors spread far beyond the borders of the town. Moved by their incredible courage, local business leaders and residents gathered together to establish a permanent initiative. They created a special funding program specifically designed to cover the medical costs, adoption fees, and housing assistance needed to pair retired veterans with senior rescue dogs. They realized that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones society assumes have already fought their final battle, waiting patiently in the shadows for just one more chance to prove their unwavering loyalty.